I didn't have a breakdown. I didn't collapse, scream, or cry on the floor. I just woke up one morning and realized that the life I was living didn't belong to me. That realization came quietly, which made it more terrifying. I opened my eyes before the alarm. The room was still dark, the world silent. For a moment, I didn't know where I was, and in that brief confusion, I felt something close to relief. Then memory returned. My name. My responsibilities. My routine. The relief vanished. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing, and a thought formed with disturbing clarity: if I disappeared today, this life would continue without resistance. Not because it was meaningless, but because it had learned how to function without my presence. That's when I understood how far gone I was. From the outside, everything looked fine. That's what people always say. I had a life that made sense. A job with structure. Relationships built on history. A future that followed a logical sequence. Nothing was obviously wrong. And that was the problem. I moved through my days efficiently, like someone following instructions written by another version of himself years ago. Every choice I made felt pre-approved. Predictable. Safe. I couldn't remember the last time I had asked myself whether I actually wanted any of it. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped choosing and started continuing. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like. That life wasn't about excitement or meaning anymore, but about consistency. Stability. Responsibility. I repeated those words often enough that they stopped sounding like excuses. But my body disagreed. I felt it in the mornings, the heaviness before my feet touched the floor. In the evenings, the strange exhaustion that had nothing to do with effort. In the quiet moments, the ones where distraction failed and silence crept in. Silence was the most dangerous part. Because silence asked questions. I began to notice how disconnected I felt from my own reactions. Good news barely registered. Bad news felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I responded appropriately without feeling appropriately. I was performing my own life. And I was very good at it. People trusted me because I was consistent. Because I didn't surprise them. Because I didn't make things complicated. I had built a reputation around being reliable. What no one saw was the cost. Every year, I felt something narrow inside me. Options closed quietly. Curiosity faded. Desire became theoretical rather than urgent. I didn't lose my dreams dramatically. I postponed them indefinitely. I told myself I'd revisit them later when things were calmer, when I was more secure, when it made sense. Later became a place I never arrived at. One evening, I caught myself watching an old video of myself. I don't even remember why. Curiosity, maybe. Nostalgia. I barely recognized the person on the screen, not because he was younger but because he was present. He spoke with conviction. He laughed without restraint. He seemed to exist fully in his own body. I felt grief in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not for what I had lost but for what I had abandoned. That night, I sat alone and tried to trace the moment when my life stopped being mine. There was no single turning point. Just a series of reasonable decisions. Choices made to avoid conflict. To maintain comfort. To meet expectations that never explicitly asked for my surrender. I had said yes when I meant maybe. Stayed silent when I meant no. Chosen paths that made sense instead of ones that felt alive. None of it seemed dangerous at the time. Together, it was devastating. The hardest part was admitting that no one had taken my life from me. I had handed it over willingly. In exchange for safety. In exchange for approval. In exchange for the illusion that I could always change later. That morning, the one that started all of this, I finally understood something that frightened me more than regret: time doesn't wait for clarity. It keeps moving, quietly collecting the years you don't claim. and I had let it take too many already. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: if I kept living this way, one day I would wake up and realize I had lived an entire life without ever truly being there. And that was a future I couldn't survive. After that morning, I tried to return to normal. That word normal suddenly felt suspicious. I went through the motions as usual. Coffee. Commute. Conversations that required nodding at the right moments. Tasks I could complete without thinking. From the outside, nothing had shifted. Inside, everything had. It felt like I had seen something I couldn't unsee. Like the curtain had been pulled back just enough to show me how automated my existence had become. I started noticing how often I avoided myself. Any moment of stillness made me uneasy. I reached for my phone instinctively. Filled silence with noise. Kept my mind occupied so it wouldn't wander into dangerous territory. Dangerous thoughts like, is this all my life will be? When did I agree to this version of myself? What exactly am I waiting for? Those questions didn't demand answers right away. They just lingered, heavy and patient. I began to feel a low-level panic that never fully surfaced. Not anxiety attacks. Not visible distress. Just a constant sense of pressure, like I was holding my breath without realizing it. I realized how much effort it took to remain functional. How many decisions I made purely to preserve momentum. How often I chose the path of least resistance simply because stopping would force me to confront the truth. I had mistaken motion for progress. One evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table, lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about all the things I had once believed I would do someday. Someday I'd take risks. Someday I'd choose differently. Someday I'd become the person I felt capable of being. Someday never arrived because it was never scheduled. It existed only as a comforting idea, proof that I hadn't given up completely. But comfort, I was learning, can be a form of anesthesia. I started reviewing my past with brutal honesty. Not to judge myself, but to understand the pattern. Every major decision had been guided by one question: what is the safest option right now? Not the truest. Not the most meaningful. The safest. At first, that approach protected me. It helped me build stability. Structure. A life that didn't fall apart. But over time, safety stopped being a tool and became a cage. I felt resentment rising, not toward others, but toward myself. Resentment for the years I had spent being careful when I should have been curious. For the risks I never took because they didn't come with guarantees. That resentment scared me. So I tried to suppress it, like I had suppressed everything else. I told myself to be grateful. To focus on what I had. To stop being dramatic. Those arguments worked less and less. Gratitude can't replace authenticity. Appreciation can't substitute presence. I noticed how detached I had become from joy. Even positive moments felt distant, like they were happening behind glass. I responded appropriately without feeling deeply. I wasn't depressed. I was disconnected. That distinction mattered. Depression feels heavy. Disconnection feels empty. And emptiness is harder to explain, especially when your life looks fine on paper. People around me talked about the future with confidence. Plans, milestones, expectations. I participated, but something inside me resisted committing emotionally. Every long-term plan felt like a sentence being extended rather than rewritten. I began to realize that the problem wasn't my circumstances. It was consent. I was living a life I had stopped consenting to. And every day I continued without acknowledging that truth felt like a quiet violation. There were moments I considered radical escape. Not suicide, disappearance. Changing cities. Starting somewhere anonymous. Leaving behind the version of myself everyone knew. The idea wasn't appealing because of freedom. It was appealing because of erasure. That scared me enough to pause. Because wanting to erase yourself isn't a desire for death. It's a desire to stop being who you've become. I understood then that I didn't need to vanish. I needed to confront the life I was avoiding. But confrontation requires courage, and courage demands loss. Loss of approval. Loss of certainty. Loss of the story where everything made sense. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Some days, I almost convinced myself to forget everything. To settle back into the familiar rhythm. To accept that this quiet dissatisfaction was just the cost of being an adult. Many people do that. They survive, but survival started to feel like a threat rather than a goal. I asked myself a question that wouldn't leave me alone. If nothing changes, who will I be in 10 years? The answer came immediately and without mercy. Still functional. Still responsible. Still absent. That image terrified me more than uncertainty ever could. Because uncertainty still contains possibility. That was when I understood something fundamental. I wasn't afraid of failing. I was afraid of waking up one day and realizing I had never truly tried. That realization didn't give me a plan. But it did something more important. It made staying feel impossible. I didn't change my life all at once. That would have been easier to explain. What I actually did was stop pretending that everything was fine. And that, I learned, is far more disruptive than any dramatic escape. The first real change wasn't external. It was internal consent. I stopped consenting to a life that felt rehearsed. Stopped agreeing to futures that didn't include my inner voice. Stopped calling endurance a virtue when it was slowly turning into self-erasure. This wasn't a brave decision. It felt humiliating. Admitting that I had built a life I no longer wanted meant admitting that I had been wrong, not about the world, but about myself. Wrong about what I needed. Wrong about what I valued. Wrong about how much of myself I was willing to lose for comfort. I had spent years defending my choices as rational, sensible, mature. Letting go of that narrative felt like standing naked in front of my own truth. There were moments of panic. Moments when the old reflexes screamed at me to go back. To apologize for changing. To reassure everyone and myself that nothing was really different. But something in me had crossed a threshold. I couldn't unknow what I knew. Every time I tried to imagine continuing exactly as before, my body reacted first. Tight chest. Shallow breath. A dull heaviness that felt like grief without an object. My body had already rejected the life my mind was still trying to defend. So I began letting things end. Quietly. I withdrew from roles that existed only because I never said no. I stopped investing energy in relationships that required me to remain frozen in an outdated version of myself. I allowed plans to dissolve instead of forcing myself into them out of obligation. Some people noticed immediately. Some didn't notice at all. Some noticed and resented me for it. I didn't argue. I was too tired to perform justification anymore. There were losses I couldn't soften. Certain connections couldn't survive without my constant compliance. Certain versions of me, the dependable one, the endlessly patient one, the one who never disrupted, faded away. I mourned them. Grief didn't arrive as sadness alone. It arrived as guilt. As doubt. As the temptation to reverse everything just to feel forgiven again. But forgiveness from others would have required abandoning myself once more, and I couldn't do that again. Starting over wasn't inspiring. It was awkward. Uncertain. Lonely. There were days when I felt like I had made a terrible mistake, when the old life seemed easier, clearer, more respectable. Days when I missed the predictability more than I cared to admit. But I noticed something important. Even on my worst days, I felt present. Uncomfortable but present. Afraid but present. Uncertain but present. I hadn't felt that in years. I learned that peace isn't the absence of discomfort. It's the absence of self-betrayal. Slowly, my relationship with time changed. Days stopped blending together. Mornings felt distinct from evenings. Choices felt heavier but also more real. I began to ask myself a different kind of question. Not what should I do but what can I live with. That question stripped everything down to essentials. I stopped chasing approval from people who only knew the version of me that survived by disappearing. I stopped explaining my choices to those who measured life only by stability and milestones. I accepted that some people would never understand why I left a life that worked. Because it never worked for me. I don't romanticize this ending. Some doors closed permanently. Some opportunities passed without return. Some relationships exist now only as memories. That is the cost. But staying would have cost me something worse. Myself. If you're listening to this and you feel that quiet, persistent discomfort, not pain, not crisis, just the sense that you're living slightly out of alignment, please hear this: you don't need a catastrophe to justify change. You don't need permission to stop living on autopilot. And you don't need to hate your life to admit it no longer fits you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to endure. It's to admit that endurance has turned into avoidance. I didn't wake up at 40 and ruin my life. I woke up and realized I still had one. And that I could no longer afford to live it as a spectator. I don't know exactly where this path leads. But for the first time in a long time, I am walking it consciously. And that more than comfort, more than approval, feels like being alive again.